His voice is booming, untouchable, and absolute. In 1972, Hollywood weaponized that exact baritone to stand Roscoe Lee Browne beside John Wayne as the ultimate symbol of straight American masculinity. Yet that towering performance was a desperate lie built for survival. Because as a black gay man navigating an industry eager to destroy him, Browne knew a single rumor meant total erasure. To save his career, he built his own prison, completely giving up marriage in exchange for 84 years of total isolation. Hollywood paid millions for his commanding voice on one brutal, unspoken condition: that he use it to permanently bury who he was until his dying breath. Browne was born in 1922. The 1920s and 1930s presented a notoriously hostile environment for Black Americans. In response to systemic oppression, a survival strategy had taken root within middle-class Black communities, heavily enforced by the church. It was known as the politics of respectability. As the son of a Baptist minister, Browne did not merely observe this cultural mandate, he was raised as its prime exhibit. The doctrine dictated that presenting an image of flawless morality, high education, and unassailable dignity was the only viable armor against a society eager to criminalize or demean Black citizens. People in this era were taught that any personal failing would not be viewed as an individual mistake, but as an indictment of their entire community. For a minister's son, the pressure to project perfection was absolute. Browne recognized early on that intellectual superiority and physical discipline were the most effective shields against a hostile world. Unlike many contemporaries who entered the entertainment industry through the grueling circuit of vaudeville or nightclubs, Browne took a distinctly elite path. He enrolled at Lincoln University in Pennsylvania, the first degree-granting historically Black university in the United States. The environment at Lincoln was designed to forge leaders, instilling fierce pride and rigorous academic standards. Browne dominated this environment. He became a formidable athlete, ultimately securing a national championship in track and field. The discipline required for elite athletics, the meticulous control of the body, the endurance of pain, the public performance of physical perfection, mirrored the psychological control he would later exert over his personal life. Athletics were only one facet of his armor. Browne cultivated an intellect that made him virtually untouchable. He pursued postgraduate studies at Middlebury College and Columbia University. He mastered multiple languages and spent years teaching French and comparative literature at his alma mater. By the time he decided to transition into acting in his mid-30s, he was a fully formed intellectual powerhouse. He possessed the vocabulary, the bearing, and the sheer confidence of an academic aristocrat. This background fundamentally altered how he interacted with the entertainment industry. When he finally walked into casting rooms in New York, he brought a resume and a presence that the system was entirely unequipped to handle. In the late 1950s and 1960s, the roles available to Black actors were severely restricted by an industry operating on a rigid hierarchy. Studios routinely relegated minorities to subservient, comedic, or criminal roles. Browne categorically rejected this framework. He refused to play by the established rules, turning down lucrative offers to play maids, butlers, or caricatures. He demanded to be treated as a gentleman of the theater. This unwavering stance led to one of the most defining anecdotes of his early career. When an established white director critiqued Browne during an audition, suggesting his refined speaking voice sounded too white, Browne did not apologize or alter his delivery. Instead, he coldly informed the director that he had once employed a white maid. This response was not a mere comeback, it was a tactical strike. It signaled a total refusal to adopt the submissive posture expected of a black actor. This fierce, uncompromising pride forced directors, producers, and audiences to reckon with a man who demanded equality in every room he entered. However, this self-imposed pedestal created an impossible and isolating standard. By elevating himself as a beacon of black excellence and a paragon of moral fortitude, Browne inadvertently sealed his own trap. In the unforgiving climate of mid-century America, maintaining this pristine image left no margin for personal vulnerability. To be a pioneer meant carrying the weight of collective representation. Furthermore, Browne entered the public eye during the height of the Lavender Scare, a period when the federal government and private industries systematically hunted down and fired suspected homosexuals. Hollywood was deeply complicit in this purge, strictly enforcing morality clauses to blacklist anyone who deviated from heteronormative standards. To be a black gay man in the public eye during this era was a guaranteed death sentence for any professional ambition. Browne was highly educated and acutely aware of these political currents. His strategy of hyper-intellectualism and aristocratic distance was a calculated survival mechanism. By speaking with the precision of a literature professor and carrying himself with the stoicism of a statesman, he created a persona so intimidating and polished that few dared to pry into his personal life. He became the unapproachable professional. Interviewers asked him about Shakespeare, French poetry, and civil rights, never about his romantic life. He guided the narrative masterfully, ensuring the spotlight remained strictly on his intellect and his work. He established a precedent of absolute perfection, setting the stage for a career defined by immense public respect and profound private silence. The theater world of New York, where Browne initially built his formidable reputation alongside the New York Shakespeare Festival, offered a certain bohemian buffer. The stage demanded physical presence, but the theater community historically harbored a silent, albeit fragile tolerance for the underground lives of its artists. Hollywood, however, was an entirely different industrial complex. It was an industry built on the mass distribution of an idealized, deeply conservative American image. When Browne transitioned to film and television, he did not just step in front of a camera. He stepped into a legal and public relations apparatus designed to regulate human behavior. The foundation of this control was the standard morality clause embedded in every studio contract. Originating during the era of the Hays Code, these clauses were not merely archaic formalities. They were active, legally binding tripwires. They granted studios the absolute right to terminate a contract, sue for damages, and effectively blacklist an actor if they engaged in conduct that offended public morals. In the 1960s, homosexuality was not just a moral scandal. It was classified as a mental illness by the psychiatric establishment and remained a felony in almost every state. For a black actor whose presence on screen was already heavily scrutinized by a racially divided public, the margin for error was non-existent. A scandal would not just end his career, It would be weaponized by the press to validate racist stereotypes about the moral failings of Black Americans. Faced with this institutional threat, Browne and the PR machinery surrounding him engineered a specific narrative to neutralize any curiosity about his private life. They utilized one of Hollywood's most effective and well-worn shields, the trope of the confirmed bachelor. Because Browne possessed an intimidating intellect and a commanding aristocratic demeanor, the press easily digested the narrative that he was a man simply married to his craft. He was framed as a classical scholar, too consumed by French poetry, Shakespearean soliloquies, and intellectual pursuits to bother with the mundane trappings of a traditional family life. It was a brilliant clinical strategy. By elevating his lack of a wife to an intellectual choice, he sanitized his isolation. He offered the media a respectable void, unlike other closeted actors of the era who were forced into studio-arranged marriages or fake, highly publicized dates with starlets. Browne chose a path of absolute zero. He gave them nothing to photograph, nothing to speculate on, and nothing to tear down. This public desexualization mirrored the roles the Hollywood machinery offered him. As the industry faced pressure from the civil rights movement to present more dignified Black characters, studios recognized Browne's unique marketability. He was the perfect, safe Black intellectual. Consequently, he was consistently cast in roles that stripped him of any romantic or sexual agency. He played judges, doctors, professors, and dignified confidants. In Alfred Hitchcock's 1969 espionage thriller, Topaz, he played an urbane Martinican spy. In The Comedians, alongside Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor, he played an articulate journalist. These casting choices served a dual purpose for the studios. First, they allowed Hollywood to appear progressive by casting a Black man in roles of authority, while conveniently sidestepping the explosive, racially charged taboo of depicting Black male sexuality or romance on screen. Second, it perfectly aligned with Browne's need to remain an asexual entity in the public consciousness. He became the steadying voice of reason, the narrator of other people's dramas, a man existing entirely above the fray of human desire. The psychological toll of navigating this machinery required relentless, daily vigilance. Every interview, every press junket, and every interaction on a film set was a calculated performance. The environment on a standard Hollywood set in the late 1960s and 1970s was steeped in a loud performative machismo. Camera crews, stuntmen, and directors operated within a boys' club mentality where crude posturing and heteronormative banter were the standard languages of camaraderie. To survive in this environment without drawing suspicion, Browne had to project a solid, unquestionable masculinity while internally remaining entirely detached. The stakes were heightened by the broader political climate. During the 1960s, Browne was visibly active in the civil rights movement, using his platform to support the cause. This placed him in the crosshairs of J. Edgar Hoover's FBI, an agency known to actively monitor prominent Black figures and relentlessly search for deviant sexual behavior to use for blackmail and character assassination. The structural destruction of civil rights strategist Bayard Rustin, who was marginalized within the movement because of his homosexuality, served as a stark, terrifying precedent. Browne understood that his secret was not just a liability to his bankability as an actor. It was a vulnerability that could be exploited by the state to damage the broader political movements he supported. Therefore, the straight illusion was not just about securing the next role. It was a matter of total, comprehensive survival. He locked his authentic self away in a vault, swallowed the key, and presented the world with an impenetrable monument of a man. The tragedy was that the monument was so convincing, the industry forgot there was a human being trapped inside it. Because the public narrative surrounding Roscoe Lee Browne was one of total, impenetrable isolation. An assumption took root that he lived an entirely solitary existence. The Hollywood press corps and the public accepted the image of the stoic scholar reading Proust alone in his study. The reality of his existence, however, was vastly different and intricately hidden. The survival of a closeted, elite black actor in the 1960s and 1970s did not rely on complete isolation, but rather on integration into a highly exclusive, fiercely protected underground ecosystem. For men of Browne's stature, class, and racial prominence, survival precluded stepping foot into public, mob-run gay bars that were routinely raided by the LAPD or the NYPD. A raid meant arrest, a publicized mugshot, and the instantaneous termination of a career. Instead, the black gay elite operated within a clandestine network of private salons, closed-door dinner parties, and heavily vetted social circles. This was an extension of the cultural networks established during the Harlem Renaissance, adapted for the surveillance-heavy era of the Cold War and the Civil Rights Movement. Access to this inner circle required absolute discretion. Trust was the currency of survival. Within these fortified private spaces, the armor could briefly come off. It was here that Browne cultivated his true peer group, engaging in an environment where his intellect, his race, and his sexuality were not mutually exclusive liabilities. The most significant and enduring anchor in Browne's private life was his profound friendship with the literary giant James Baldwin. The dynamic between Browne and Baldwin offers a crucial lens into Browne's psychological landscape. The two men shared a deep intellectual kinship. Both were highly educated, both had spent formative time absorbing the cultural freedoms of France, and both possessed a linguistic brilliance that they used to dismantle white supremacy in their respective fields. Yet their public strategies for dealing with their sexuality were diametrically opposed. Baldwin was famously combative and unapologetic. With the publication of Giovanni's Room in 1956, Baldwin had placed a target on his own back, refusing to hide his queerness, which made him a polarizing figure, even within the black civil rights leadership. Baldwin lived his life out loud, frequently resulting in periods of intense public backlash, surveillance by J. Edgar Hoover's FBI, and crushing bouts of depression. Browne took the opposite path, operating entirely in the shadows. Consequently, their friendship settled into a distinct asymmetrical power dynamic. When Baldwin was buckling under the immense weight of his public crusades, exhausted by the hostility of the press and the relentless demands of the movement, he retreated to the safety of Browne's private orbit. Browne assumed the role of the steadfast protector. Armed with his unflappable demeanor and emotional discipline, Browne provided a rare, secure harbor for Baldwin. He was the confidant who did not need anything from the writer, the steadying force who could talk Baldwin through his darkest psychological crises. However, industry insiders and historians who have examined this era note a tragic caveat to this dynamic. Browne spent his private hours acting as the emotional bedrock for his peers, absorbing their traumas and shielding them from the brutal realities of the outside world. But because of his own ironclad commitment to stoicism and his refusal to ever appear vulnerable, it was widely understood within their inner circle that Browne had no one to do the same for him. He was the anchor for others, but he navigated his own suppressed desires, his paranoia, and his profound fears entirely alone. He was trapped by his own strength. The psychological cost of maintaining this dual existence is difficult to quantify, but the physical danger of the closet was occasionally laid bare in brutal fashion. The most glaring example of the system's violence against Browne occurred in 1968 during the production of the film Uptight. Directed by Jules Dassin, Uptight was a powder keg of a project, shot in the immediate volatile aftermath of the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. The film dealt directly with black militant groups and the racial agony tearing America apart. The set itself was fraught with tension, populated by actors deeply immersed in the Black Power movement. Browne was cast in the role of Clarence, an urbane, highly polished informant who operated adjacent to the white establishment. It was a character that closely mirrored Browne's own sophisticated public persona, a stark contrast to the revolutionary fervor of the other characters. It was within this highly charged, hyper-masculine environment that Browne's carefully constructed defenses were breached. The details of the incident remained buried for decades, only coming to light in the 2011 memoir A Giant to Remember by Browne's co-star, Jitu Kumbuka. Kumbuka, a physically imposing actor who played a militant in the film, operated within the rigid, often homophobic machismo standard of the era. According to Kumbuka's recounting of the production, there was a quiet but persistent tension on set regarding Browne. Kumbuka alleged that Browne had engaged in behavior that he interpreted as overly familiar or flirtatious. What followed was a stark demonstration of the era's ruthless hierarchy. Egged on by other crew members who were hostile to Browne's perceived differences, Kumbuka confronted the veteran actor. By his own admission in his memoir, Kumbuka reacted with sudden and extreme physical violence. He struck Browne, a man almost 20 years his senior, and a highly respected figure in the theater world, and physically threw him out of a doorway. The violence of the act was horrific, but Browne's reaction is what truly illustrates the suffocating grip of the Hollywood closet. He had been assaulted and publicly humiliated in front of his peers on a working film set. Yet, the esteemed actor did absolutely nothing. He did not retaliate. He did not halt production. He did not report the assault to the director, Jules Dassin, nor did he file a grievance with the Screen Actors Guild. Browne's silence was not an act of cowardice. It was a cold, calculated survival metric. To report the assault would require explaining the context of the altercation. It would force an official inquiry into Kumbuka's allegations regarding Browne's sexuality. In 1968, the Hollywood establishment would not offer sympathy to a victim of a homophobic hate crime. The moral panic of the era dictated that the deviant was always at fault. If Browne escalated the situation, the studio executives would view him, not his attacker, as the liability. His contract would likely be terminated under the morality clause, his reputation would be fed to the tabloids, and his meticulously built career would vanish overnight. Furthermore, the LAPD at the time was actively engaged in the harassment and entrapment of gay men. Involving law enforcement would have been tantamount to professional suicide. Browne was trapped in a perfect, inescapable snare. The power dynamics of the industry dictated that his assailant held all the cards simply by adhering to the heterosexual norm. Faced with the total destruction of his life's work, Browne chose the only option the system allowed him. He swallowed the indignity. He absorbed the physical pain and the profound psychological humiliation, adjusted his tailored suit, and walked back onto the set. He was forced to stand mere feet away from the man who had just assaulted him, look him in the eye, and deliver his lines with the flawless diction and unwavering authority that the studio was paying for. It was a master class in acting, born of absolute, terrifying necessity. It was the ultimate unspoken tax exacted upon him by an industry that demanded his talent but held his humanity in complete contempt. The dawn of the 1980s introduced a terrifying new variable into the carefully calibrated existence of closeted Hollywood professionals. The arrival of the HIV/AIDS epidemic fundamentally altered the mechanics of survival. Prior to this public health crisis, the threat of being outed was primarily professional and social. It meant the loss of contracts, the evaporation of public standing, and exile from the studio system. With the onset of the epidemic, homosexuality was abruptly reframed by the media and the political establishment not just as a moral failing, but as a lethal contagion. The paranoia within the entertainment industry escalated into a blind institutional panic. Studios, now increasingly absorbed by risk-averse multinational conglomerates, viewed any association with the disease as a catastrophic liability. The financial infrastructure of Hollywood reacted ruthlessly. Completion bond companies and insurance firms, which underwrote the massive budgets of feature films, began scrutinizing the private lives of actors with unprecedented aggression. Rumors of homosexuality were no longer just gossip. They were viewed as uninsurable medical risks. Following the highly publicized death of Rock Hudson in 1985, the industry's tolerance for ambiguity vanished. The tabloids, sensing blood in the water, launched aggressive campaigns to out suspected actors, weaponizing the public's fear of the virus to sell magazines. For an actor in Roscoe Lee Browne's position, navigating this era required a level of psychological endurance that bordered on the superhuman. He was entering his 60s. The clandestine, highly protected underground ecosystem of black gay intellectuals and artists, the only sanctuary he had ever known, was being systematically decimated by the disease. Many close to the center of this world noted the rapid disintegration of their safety networks. Private salons and closed-door gatherings, once the bedrock of their social survival, became infrequent. The fear of association was simply too high. To be seen visiting a specific hospital ward, or to be photographed attending the funeral of a man known to have died of the virus, was enough to trigger an industry blacklist. This created a profound, unresolvable psychological trauma. Browne and his closeted contemporaries were forced to witness the annihilation of their community while maintaining an absolute, stone-faced public detachment. They were denied the fundamental human right to mourn publicly. When peers fell ill, the mechanics of the Hollywood closet dictated that they be hidden away, their diagnoses altered by publicists to pneumonia or exhaustion. Browne, a man who had built his entire persona on projecting authority and unshakable dignity, was forced into a state of silent complicity. The confirmed bachelor persona, once a tactical shield, now ensured he mourned his peers entirely alone. The pressure of maintaining this facade during a plague years took a severe, invisible toll. While younger actors or those in the music industry often turn to narcotics or extreme substance abuse as an anesthesia against the sheer terror of the closet, Browne's coping mechanism was strictly professional. He did not self-destruct in public. A public breakdown would invite the very scrutiny he had spent his life avoiding. Instead, his anesthesia was the work itself. He adopted a relentless, obsessive work ethic, effectively using his career to block out the psychological reality of his existence. He worked continuously, moving from television guest spots to stage readings, refusing to leave any empty space in his schedule where the reality of his isolation might settle in. However, the physical demands of live-action filmmaking were changing. As Browne aged, the intense scrutiny of the camera lens, the grueling hours on physical sets, and the constant, inescapable presence of crews became increasingly difficult to manage. The camera demands a specific type of vulnerability, and for a man expending massive amounts of energy to remain entirely walled off, the physical presence required by film acting became a liability. He needed an environment where he could continue to work, continue to earn, but where his physical body was no longer subject to inspection. The solution was a strategic and highly lucrative retreat. Browne began to aggressively pivot his career away from live-action performance and into the recording booth. He transitioned into the booming industry of voiceover acting and narration. For the Hollywood machinery, this was a flawless transaction. Studios recognized that Browne possessed one of the most authoritative, marketable, and universally respected voices in the English language. They could extract the immense commercial value of his baritone to anchor massive global franchises, animated features, and documentaries, without ever having to put his physical body on a press tour or a movie poster. He became the voice of the narrator in the blockbuster family film Babe, a role that brought his voice into millions of homes globally. He provided voice work for major animated series like Spider-Man and Batman, and narrated sprawling historical documentaries. The recording booth provided the ultimate impenetrable closet. It was a sterile, isolated environment. There were no co-stars to navigate, no crew members to trigger altercations, and no cameras to capture a fleeting moment of exhaustion or vulnerability. He would enter the booth, deliver a flawless vocal performance with his trademark precision, and leave. This transition was a brilliant tactical maneuver for survival, but it carried a devastating irony. By leaning into voiceover work, Browne found a way to remain culturally ubiquitous while physically disappearing. He became a phantom in the industry. The studio stripped away the complexities of the black gay intellectual and reduced him to a disembodied instrument of authority. The system enthusiastically capitalized on his voice, using it to project warmth, wisdom, and paternal reassurance to audiences around the world, all while ensuring the man himself remained completely invisible. The recording booth kept him safe, it kept him wealthy, and it ensured his legacy, but it also functioned as a velvet-lined sensory deprivation tank, slowly erasing his physical presence from the world while he was still alive. The survival strategies Roscoe Lee Browne employed during the 1960s and 1970s were fundamentally unequipped to handle the attrition of time. In December 1987, his closest confidant, James Baldwin, died of stomach cancer in France. Baldwin's death severed Browne's primary connection to a shared, authentic reality. With Baldwin gone, the clandestine network of black queer intellectuals that had defined the mid-century underground rapidly dissolved. Browne found himself as the last man standing from a specific vital era. While his private world was collapsing, his public persona was being elevated to institutional status. The television industry in the 1980s was dominated by a new wave of black respectability politics, spearheaded by massive network sitcoms. The cultural mandate was to present black families and authority figures as flawless, highly educated, and entirely non-threatening to the white conservative mainstream. Browne was the ultimate asset for this specific agenda. In 1986, he won an Emmy Award for his guest appearance on The Cosby Show. He played Dr. Barnabas Foster, an erudite, intimidating, and brilliant professor. The casting was highly strategic. The producers required an actor who inherently commanded absolute moral and intellectual authority to legitimize the show's curated image of upper-middle-class perfection. The irony embedded in this casting is staggering. The biggest family sitcom in American television history, a show that rigorously policed the image of its cast to present a pristine, heteronormative ideal, utilized a closeted gay man as its ultimate symbol of patriarchal dignity. Browne delivered the performance with his trademark precision, reinforcing the rigid, asexual, and distinguished trope that the industry demanded of him. He was effectively weaponized by the television networks to validate a highly sanitized version of reality. He accepted the accolades, stood at the podiums, and delivered eloquent acceptance speeches, ensuring the mask never slipped. The system rewarded him handsomely for his compliance, cementing his status as an unassailable elder statesman of the screen. As the 1990s progressed, the cultural climate in Hollywood began to experience a slow, highly publicized thaw regarding sexuality. Sitcoms began featuring gay characters, and a new generation of actors started to test the boundaries of the closet. However, this shifting tide offered absolutely no salvation for a man in Browne's position. The new rules of the 1990s applied primarily to young white actors. For a black man entering his late 70s, whose entire brand equity was built upon a mid-century template of unyielding masculinity and aristocratic detachment, coming out was structurally impossible. To reveal his truth in his twilight years would be to admit a half-century of deception. It would instantly recontextualize his entire body of work and shatter the dignified, honest persona that the public trusted. He was a hostage to his own precedent. The trap he had built in the 1950s was now sealed shut by his own success. As the cultural landscape of the 1990s shifted, Browne solidified his absolute dominance in the recording booth. He narrated historical documentaries for PBS and provided the voice for sweeping commercial campaigns. Industry insiders note the specific way studios utilized him during this period. They did not just hire him to read copy, they hired him to be the voice of God. Directors relied on his baritone to inject immediate historical weight and unquestionable truth into their projects. The industry paid millions for the resonance of his vocal cords, effectively decoupling his massive vocal presence from his physical reality. He could arrive, deliver a flawless recitation of the text, and disappear back into the vast, anonymous sprawl of Los Angeles. By the time he reached his 80s, this strategic retreat had evolved into a stark physical reality, because he had spent a lifetime erasing any trace of romantic partnership or domestic vulnerability from the public record. There was no documented infrastructure of care surrounding him as his health inevitably began to wane. He had outlived the underground networks of his youth and had rigorously denied himself the public companionship that usually anchors a person in their final years. He remained the stoic, independent scholar to the very end. The industry saw an icon gracefully transitioning into a voiceover legend, entirely blind to the profound architectural loneliness required to execute that performance. The 1990s heralded a radical, highly visible shift in how Hollywood monetized and processed queer narratives. The release of major studio films like Philadelphia in 1993 and the aggressive rise of the new queer cinema movement at festivals like Sundance signaled that the industry was finally ready to commodify gay stories. A new generation of actors, directors, and executives began to cautiously dismantle the concrete closets of the mid-century. For the public, this era felt like a triumph of progress and visibility. However, for the surviving members of Hollywood's old guard, men like Roscoe Lee Browne, who had spent 50 years successfully navigating a regime of terror, this new visibility did not register as liberation. It registered as a profound, destabilizing threat. The psychological architecture of a man who survived the Lavender Scare and the height of the FBI's surveillance state was not built to adapt to the talk show confessional culture of the late 1990s. Browne had negotiated his survival through absolute, terrifying silence. The new generation's demand for transparency felt reckless to those who knew exactly how quickly the machinery could turn on them. To step into the light now would not be perceived by the public as an act of bravery. It would be framed by the tabloid media as a decades-long deception. It would subject his pristine aristocratic legacy to the very retroactive scrutiny he had sacrificed his personal life to avoid. Consequently, as the culture around him opened up, Browne locked his doors even tighter. Without the outlet of a public romantic life and with his clandestine peer group decimated by the AIDS crisis, Browne required a mechanism to process the immense psychological pressure of his isolation. He did not turn to the destructive, highly visible coping mechanisms, alcoholism, public erratic behavior, or narcotics that frequently derailed the careers of younger closeted stars. The Hollywood machinery was too unforgiving of black actors to allow him the luxury of a public breakdown. A scandal involving substance abuse would have immediately stripped him of his carefully cultivated intellectual authority. Instead, Browne's anesthesia was entirely clinical and professionally sanctioned. He weaponized his workaholism. He flooded his schedule. He accepted roles across a staggering variety of mediums, ensuring there was never a vacuum of silence in his daily life. The work itself became a somatic barrier against the reality of his profound loneliness. If he was memorizing lines, traveling to sets, or sitting in recording booths, he did not have to sit alone with his own thoughts. His relentless schedule fueled an era of unprecedented vocal omnipresence, leading him to some of the most iconic roles of the decade. Between 1994 and 1998, he provided the voice for Wilson Fisk, the Kingpin, in the highly successful Spider-Man animated series. The casting was a masterstroke of vocal authority. The character of Kingpin was a massive, untouchable, hyper-masculine crime lord who controlled the city from a heavily fortified penthouse, untouchable by the law and insulated from the street-level chaos. There is a chilling resonance in Browne, lending his majestic, unshakable baritone to a character defined entirely by absolute control and hidden power. Simultaneously, he served as the omniscient narrator for the 1995 blockbuster family film, Babe. The film was a massive global phenomenon, earning hundreds of millions of dollars and securing a Best Picture nomination. Browne's voice guided the audience through the narrative. He was the voice of absolute benevolent truth. The studios heavily marketed his narration as the warm, grandfatherly soul of the film. Millions of families bought tickets to hear him speak, completely oblivious to the bitter irony that the man providing the ultimate comforting truth of the story was living a life defined by a mandatory structural maiai. The studios extracted the warmth of his voice, monetized it on a global scale, and left the man himself entirely detached from the product. This intense, relentless work schedule served as a necessary psychological numbing agent, but the human body cannot infinitely process the stress of constant hypervigilance. The somatic toll of the closet is a well-documented medical reality. Decades of shallow breathing, the constant low-grade adrenaline of potential discovery, and the rigorous policing of every physical gesture and vocal inflection exert a massive toll on the central nervous system. Browne was a former elite athlete, a man who possessed immense physical discipline, but the stress of his era aged the mid-century gay generation in unique and brutal ways. The energy required to maintain the straight illusion acts as a parasite, draining the host's vitality to keep the public mask intact. When Browne did appear on camera during his later years, he gravitated toward roles that reinforced his untouchable status. He became a fixture in the Law Order television ecosystem. He was frequently cast as defense attorneys, or most notably, as judges. In the rigid, procedural world of network television, the judge sits quite literally above the rest of the cast. They are the final arbiter of morality, truth, and consequences. For Browne, sitting behind the elevated mahogany bench on a soundstage offered the ultimate protective coloring. The system allowed him to don the black robes and dispense justice on television, utilizing his authoritative presence to anchor their fictional legal universe, all while he lived in perpetual fear of the industry's own ruthless extrajudicial judgment. Yet there were subtle, highly coded outlets where the pressure found a release valve. Unable to write a straightforward memoir that would require acknowledging his sexuality, Browne channeled his intellectual energy into poetry. He had been a literature professor, and he understood the power of abstraction. Poetry allowed him to speak the truth without stating the facts. Industry insiders and literary peers noted that his private writings and the works he chose to recite at public readings often dealt heavily with themes of masked identities, the passage of time, and the stoic endurance of hidden pain. He could express the agony of his isolation to an audience in a crowded theater, but because he was speaking in the coded language of verse, the public simply applauded his classical training. They heard a performance they did not recognize a confession. As the new millennium approached, the contrast between Browne's public omnipresence and his private reality reached its absolute zenith. He was entering his late 70s. He was universally revered, financially secure, and culturally ubiquitous. His voice echoed in movie theaters, television reruns, and documentary broadcasts across the globe. Yet, when the recording sessions ended and the studio lights powered down, he returned to an empty home in Los Angeles. There was no documented partner to share the immense weight of his legacy. He had navigated the most treacherous waters of American cultural history, successfully beating a system designed to destroy men like him. But the victory was entirely solitary. The Hollywood machinery had successfully trained him to be his own warden. The architectural stability of Roscoe Lee Browne's public persona was subjected to its most rigorous stress test in 1971 during the production of the Western film The Cowboys. Directed by Mark Rydell, the film was a major studio undertaking designed as a late-career vehicle for John Wayne. To understand the immense psychological complexity of this project for Browne, one must understand exactly what John Wayne represented at that specific cultural moment. Wayne was not merely a movie star. He was the ultimate avatar of conservative, white, heterosexual American dominance. Just months before filming began, Wayne had given a highly publicized, deeply controversial interview in which he openly endorsed white supremacy and expressed hostility toward the civil rights movement. Into this volatile environment stepped Browne. He was cast as Jebediah Nightlinger, a sophisticated, formidable camp cook who acts as a secondary paternal figure to a group of young cowboys. The power dynamics on this set were a microcosm of America's most dangerous fault lines. Browne, a highly educated black man, an active supporter of the civil rights movement, and a deeply closeted homosexual, was required to share the screen in the grueling isolation of a location shoot with the nation's most vocal champion of the conservative heteronormative establishment. The industry protocol for a black actor in this scenario was usually one of deference. Browne, true to his established strategy, opted for dominance through intellectual and professional intimidation. He memorized not only his own lines, but the entire script. He arrived on the harsh, dusty locations in immaculate attire, reading classical poetry between takes. He refused to be intimidated by Wayne's physical size or his political aura. The resulting on-screen chemistry was electric because it was grounded in a very real, high-stakes standoff. Wayne, by numerous accounts, developed a deep, grudging respect for Browne's unyielding professionalism. Yet, beneath this triumph of acting and racial barrier breaking lay a terrifying reality. In The Cowboys, Browne was required to project a bedrock of unquestionable traditional masculinity to be accepted by Wayne, and by extension, Wayne's vast conservative audience. He had to embody a hyper-competent, stoic patriarch. The irony was absolute. The man delivering the definitive performance of rugged, straight American manhood opposite the genre's biggest icon was executing a daily psychological high-wire act. Browne understood with clinical clarity that if his sexuality were discovered during this production, it would not merely be a career-ending scandal. It would actively sabotage a multi-million-dollar John Wayne picture. It would humiliate the conservative base the studio was targeting. The retaliation from the Hollywood financial infrastructure would be swift, absolute, and highly punitive. He was acting for his life. This dynamic illustrates the brutal reality of what industry historians refer to as the glass closet. The myth of the closet is that it is a perfect secret. In reality, within the elite echelons of studio executives, casting directors, and powerful publicists, the sexual orientation of men like Browne was often an open secret. But this knowledge was not held with tolerance. It was held as leverage. The studio system operated on a predatory contract. Executives would continue to hire a closeted actor, pay them well, and put them in prestigious projects on the strict, unspoken condition that the actor maintain the illusion flawlessly in public. The moment an actor slipped, the moment a tabloid obtained a photograph, or an arrest occurred in a known cruising area, the studio would instantly sever ties, citing the standard morality clause. The actor's sexuality functioned as a loaded gun kept entirely in the hands of the employers. This power dynamic kept Browne perpetually subservient to the system. No matter how many awards he won or how much intellectual superiority he projected, the men signing his checks owned the ultimate kill switch for his reputation. He was permitted to be a star only as long as he agreed to remain a hostage. This perpetual state of vulnerability dictated the geography of his daily life. For an actor of his stature, the Hollywood lifestyle typically involved a sprawling, highly visible domestic existence. Success was measured by the parties hosted, the photographs of glamorous living rooms published in magazines, and the steady stream of influential guests. Browne was forced to engineer the exact opposite. His domestic space could not be a casual hub of social activity. To invite people freely into his home was to invite an audit of his private reality. An unauthorized photograph of a guest, an overheard conversation, or simply the noticeable absence of any female romantic presence over a period of decades could trigger a fatal tabloid inquiry. Consequently, his home became a heavily restricted zone. He subjected his inner circle to intense vetting. The paranoia was not a symptom of neurosis. It was a highly accurate assessment of the threat level. The Los Angeles tabloid industry during this era, spearheaded by publications like the National Enquirer, operated vast networks of paid informants. Maids, valets, drivers, and restaurant staff were routinely bribed to provide intelligence on the private lives of celebrities. For a closeted man, every domestic employee was a potential operative for the press. Browne neutralized this threat by living an austere, highly controlled domestic life. He stripped his living space of any evidence that could be weaponized against him. He did not host the sprawling, alcohol-fueled industry gatherings that often led to loosened tongues and leaked secrets. Instead, he maintained the persona of the solitary academic, When he did entertain, it was within the strict confines of small, highly intellectual dinner parties, discussing politics and theater, ensuring the conversation never drifted toward the personal. This spatial isolation exacted a heavy somatic toll. The human nervous system is not designed to operate in a state of perpetual vigilance for 50 years. The constant low-grade adrenaline required to monitor every word spoken, every person permitted through the front door, and every glance exchanged in public acts as a corrosive agent on the body. While he presented an image of unflappable calm and regal posture to the cameras, the physical and emotional endurance required to maintain that posture was staggering. He had successfully built a fortress that the tabloids could not breach, but a fortress is, by definition, a place of confinement. He had secured his career and his legacy, but he had done so by turning his own home into a beautifully appointed solitary confinement cell. When Roscoe Lee Browne entered his 80s, the physical reality of aging stripped away his ultimate defense mechanism: absolute self-reliance. He was diagnosed with stomach cancer. For a man who had spent 50 years meticulously controlling his public image and avoiding any display of vulnerability, this illness presented a severe logistical crisis because he had operated entirely outside the parameters of a legally recognized family structure. Without a spouse or a publicly acknowledged long-term partner, his infrastructure of care had to be outsourced. Industry insiders note that end-of-life management for closeted actors of his era often defaulted to a professional apparatus. Browne's medical directives, estate planning, and daily physical care were coordinated by business managers, lawyers, and a small circle of vetted associates. He was protected by legal agreements, not by legally recognized kinship. He managed his declining health with the same rigorous privacy that defined his career. There were no public statements about his condition and no tabloid updates. Browne died at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in Los Angeles on April 11, 2007, at the age of 84. Immediately following his death, the media produced standard advance obituaries. These reports functioned as a final permanent redaction of his personal life. Major publications detailed his academic achievements, his track and field championships, and his extensive acting credits. They heavily emphasized his commanding baritone voice. However, every major obituary omitted his identity as a gay man. They listed him as leaving behind no immediate family. By relying entirely on the sanitized public relations materials generated decades earlier, the press finalized the exact illusion Browne had maintained to survive the mid-century studio system. The industry preserved his commercial brand, but permanently erased his full history in the process. Roscoe Lee Browne leveraged his intellect and discipline to carve out an elite space for a black actor in a historically restrictive era. He refused demeaning roles and forced directors to respect his boundaries, but that respect was strictly conditional. The industry allowed him to project authority on screen, provided he surrendered his authenticity off camera. The absence of a publicly acknowledged partner at his funeral and the decades of enforced public celibacy stand as objective records of the era's demands. He survived an industry built to exclude him, but doing so required the permanent suppression of his identity. He left behind a vast body of work and an unmistakable vocal legacy, given to an audience that was never permitted to know the actual man speaking the lines.